Monday morning arrived just like any other, too early, too quiet. Helen walked into the office at precisely 7:55 a.m., as she had for over a decade, clutching her travel mug filled with plain black coffee. The receptionist, a girl named Tiffany with loud acrylic nails and louder gossip, barely looked up from her phone. Helen's desk was smaller than it used to be, moved during the last restructuring to make space for the new marketing team. She didn't mind. She never needed much. At 9 o'clock sharp, she was called into a meeting with the new CEO, Scott Remington, a man barely into his 40s, with a permanent smirk and the energy of someone who thought everyone older than him had missed the boat. Beside him sat Brooke Linton, a manager recently promoted after only 9 months in the company. Helen remembered training her. Brooke smiled like she was offering Helen a cruise ticket. "We appreciate everything you've done here," Scott began, "but we're pivoting to a more modern structure, streamlined, agile, you understand." Before Helen could speak, Brooke chimed in, brushing imaginary dust off her sleeve. "This isn't personal, Helen. We just need people who can move faster, adapt. We're not in the business of holding on to dead weight." Helen sat silently, her heart calm, but her face unreadable. "I'll need you to pack your things by Friday," Scott added. "We'll make sure you're escorted out with dignity." As she stood, a junior analyst, Greg, who once asked her how to format a spreadsheet, passed by and offered a thin smile. "Don't take it personally," he mumbled, almost apologetically. Helen met his eyes, smiled politely and said, "No problem." But deep inside, something cracked, not broken, but opened. She walked out of the room with grace, past Tiffany, who now looked up with curiosity and returned to her desk. She stared at her nameplate for a moment. 15 years, reduced to a polite exit and a casual insult. They thought that was it. They had no idea how much fun Monday was going to be. Helen sat in her car longer than usual that evening. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. Her phone had no one to call, not really. Not since her son left for Oregon, not since the divorce 8 years ago, and certainly not for something as unglamorous as getting let go. Her fingers drummed on the steering wheel. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. For 15 years, Helen had never once called in sick, never missed a deadline, never taken credit for someone else's work. And for what? A half smile and the word agile thrown at her like confetti. She drove home to her modest townhouse. Neat, quiet, paid off. In the living room, Helen pulled a heavy box from the hallway closet and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were old USB drives, notepads, documents, her private insurance policy. 15 years at a company taught you more than how to file reports. It taught you where the cracks were, who took long lunches with vendors, who doctored numbers to make quarterly targets, who had skeletons, and who locked the doors too carelessly. Helen hadn't planned to use any of it, but they'd made a choice. On Wednesday morning, she walked into the office again, still officially employed. She passed Brooke's glass office. Brooke was laughing with a client on speakerphone, but the moment she saw Helen, her laughter tightened. "Helen," Brooke called, stepping out into the hall. "Do you need help sorting your files?" "No, thank you," Helen replied, her tone neutral. "Just tying up loose ends." Brooke lingered, her lips curling. "You know, sometimes a fresh start is the best thing for everyone." Helen nodded. "That's exactly what I've been thinking." As she walked away, Helen noticed Greg whispering something to Tiffany. They both looked at her, laughed. She didn't blink. Instead, she sat at her desk, inserted one of the old USB drives into the company computer, and opened a folder labeled Red Pine. Just a name. But Brooke would remember it. Scott, too, if he had half a brain. Helen smiled to herself. It was still Wednesday. Monday was coming. Helen sat at her desk, the faint hum of office chatter muffled by the thoughts forming in her mind. Her screen showed a spreadsheet, ordinary to anyone glancing over, but beneath the layers were inconsistencies she'd noticed over a year ago. Quarterly vendor payments to a company named Red Pine Solutions. Nothing unusual, except Red Pine didn't exist. Not officially. The listed services, consulting, strategy development, tech integration, were vague and overpriced. But what stood out most were the sign-offs. Brooke's name appeared first, as expected. But what Helen had only recently pieced together was the approval by a temporary executive consultant, Scott Remington, months before he became CEO, before the board even considered him. Back then, Scott had been brought in under a short-term contract to audit company operations. A quiet rumor had passed through the office. He was friendly with one of the board members' sons. Helen, as usual, said nothing. She simply watched and stored everything. Red Pine received over $180,000 in company funds across 3 quarters. No deliverables, no reports, no internal reviews. And when Scott took over as CEO, the payments stopped. Abruptly. Cleanly. Like they were never meant to be found. Helen clicked the folder marked Invoices and scrolled down to an itemized PDF she'd saved from the shared network folder months ago. It was gone now, scrubbed, but she had printed and scanned it herself. There was the invoice from Red Pine with a contact email ending in a personal Gmail address. She remembered it clearly because it used Brooke's middle name, Danielle. Helen copied the file to a fresh drive. She tucked it into her purse next to her keys. A light knock interrupted her focus. It was Greg. "Hey, Helen," he said, awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck. "Just wanted to say sorry if we were out of line the other day." Helen studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Don't worry about it." Greg hesitated. "Brooke's under a lot of pressure right now, with Scott pushing all these changes. I think she's just trying to prove herself." "I'm sure," Helen replied. He left, embarrassed, not realizing he'd just confirmed something Helen suspected. Brooke was in deeper than she could handle. Helen turned back to her screen. The final email in the folder was one she'd archived. A short message Brooke had once forwarded by mistake to the wrong Helen, the one in accounting. "Hey, Red Pine's done. Shred everything. No digital trail. Got it?" S. Helen closed the email. Then she opened a blank document and began to type. Not for HR, not for Scott, not even for Brooke. She had someone else in mind. Thursday morning, Helen didn't go to the office. She dressed neatly, as always, and drove into the city. The building she entered was nondescript, gray stone, tucked between a law firm and a coffee shop. On the 4th floor, behind a scratched glass door that read Dwyer, Mahoney and Kent Corporate Law, Helen met a woman named Dana Kent. They shook hands in a modest conference room. Dana was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with an unpretentious confidence Helen respected immediately. "You came prepared," Dana said, eyeing the thick folder Helen had brought. Helen nodded. "It's all in here. Transactions, emails, internal reports, even a few calendar screenshots. I wasn't planning to use it, but they made their choice." Dana flipped through a few pages, expression unchanged. She stopped at the invoice from Red Pine. "Brooke Linton and Scott Remington," she muttered. "I've heard Remington's name before. My firm represents one of your vendors, Haldertech. They pulled out of a renewal deal last month because of suspected financial inconsistencies." Helen lifted an eyebrow. That never made it to the company newsletter. Dana's lips curled slightly. "No, but it was serious enough for Haldertech to consider a whistleblower clause. They just didn't have an insider." Helen handed over the USB. "Now they do." Dana studied her for a moment. "What do you want from this, Helen?" "I want the truth documented. No headlines. No courtroom drama unless necessary. But I want them to know I saw everything, and I chose not to stay silent." "You don't want your job back?" Helen shook her head. "They already taught me what it's worth." Dana nodded, her tone shifting. "This gives us leverage. If what you're saying holds up, the board might want to act before it gets out. They'll want to contain this quietly." Helen glanced at the clock. "That's fine, as long as we start on Monday." As she left the law office, her steps felt steadier. She hadn't felt this focused in years. At a stoplight, she checked her phone. A message from Greg had come in. "Just found out about Red Pine. I didn't know, I swear. If there's anything I can do, I owe you." She didn't reply. Back at the office, Brooke was pacing. She had received an internal inquiry request from someone on the board. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reread it, the words blurry with panic. She didn't know how much Helen had kept, or who Helen had told, but she would soon. Friday arrived, the day Helen was supposed to pack her things and leave. She did come in, but not to pack. She walked through the lobby just as Brooke was finishing a phone call. Brooke's voice, usually smooth and confident, now wavered. "No, I don't know what she has," she said. "It was years ago, and she's leaving, so I don't even know why this is happening now." Helen didn't slow her pace. She didn't need to. By mid-morning, whispers had begun. Not loud, not accusatory, just confused. A few people noticed Brooke had locked her office door. Someone else said they saw Scott in a tense meeting with the CFO. Greg approached Helen during her second cup of coffee, cautiously. "I wasn't lying," he said. "I didn't know about Red Pine. I thought Brooke was just ambitious." Helen turned to him. "Ambition isn't the problem. It's what people are willing to do for it." He nodded. "Are you planning to go public?" "No." Greg hesitated. "Then what are you planning?" Helen smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Monday." Later that afternoon, a message hit the company intranet, a vague announcement that an internal review of legacy vendor partnerships was underway. Brooke read it and went pale. She knew exactly what it meant. Scott called her into his office before the day ended. She walked in trying to appear calm, but the door closing behind her sounded too loud. "You said everything was wiped," Scott hissed. "I thought it was," Brooke whispered. "She must have kept copies." Scott rubbed his temples. "We can't afford this, Brooke. Not now. The board's asking questions. They're not saying much, but I can feel it." "What do we do?" "We manage the narrative," he said. "We stay ahead of it. Get legal to prepare statements. If we look rattled, they'll dig deeper." As Brooke left the room, her phone vibrated. It was a blocked number. One message. "You taught me well, but you forgot who I learned from." Brooke stared at it, her throat dry. She didn't need to guess who sent it. That same Friday afternoon, in a quiet boardroom on the 19th floor, Dana Kent met with 2 members of the company's board. No press, no lawyers, just coffee, manila folders, and carefully chosen words. She didn't accuse. She presented transaction logs, email chains, a trail of approvals leading straight to Scott, masked under consulting transitions. Brooke's name was scrawled across nearly every document. Dana had done her homework. The invoices to Red Pine were unmistakably fraudulent. Board member Leonard Grant, silver-haired and notoriously cautious, tapped his fingers on the folder. "This can't go public," he muttered. "I agree," Dana replied. "That's why I came to you before it got out of control. My client doesn't want revenge. She wants accountability, quiet, internal accountability." Leonard looked to board member Elaine Warner, who had remained quiet until now. "How long has Remington been CEO?" Elaine asked. 13 months, Dana answered. "And the Red Pine money moved in the 3 months before that, while he was still under contract as an operations consultant." Elaine nodded slowly. "You understand the optics." Dana didn't flinch. "You have a small window. If you don't act now, someone else will. A vendor? A staff member? My client gave you first look because she believes this company can fix itself. Don't prove her wrong." Back at the office, Scott canceled all meetings for the afternoon. He stared at his computer screen but couldn't focus. Every notification made him jump. Brooke, meanwhile, began frantically searching her email archives for anything she might have missed. Her assistant noticed her anxiety but said nothing. She wasn't the only one watching. At 4:40 p.m., Greg walked into Helen's cubicle with a folded sheet of paper. "I know you don't trust me," he said, "but I think this might help you." Helen took the paper without speaking. It was a printed-out Slack conversation between Brooke and another team lead. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. "Brooke, she's a relic. If we don't push her out now, she'll outlast us all." Team lead: "You sure legal won't push back?" Brooke: "Already handled it. CEO's backing me." Helen looked up at Greg. He looked nervous but sincere. "I found it on an archived thread," he said. "Brooke forgot to delete it." Helen nodded. "Thank you." As Greg walked away, she carefully folded the paper and placed it into her leather purse beside her keys and lipstick. She had what she needed. Now the clock just had to tick. Saturday morning. Most of the office was quiet, empty, forgotten until Monday. But not Brooke. She sat in her apartment with a legal pad and a headache, scanning through old emails on her personal laptop. She was trying to remember what she'd said, what she'd signed, and what she'd deleted, but the gaps were too many. Her hands shook as she scribbled names and dates, searching for anything that might explain how things had unraveled so quickly. She had been so sure Helen would walk away quietly. She'd underestimated her. That mistake was haunting her now. Meanwhile, Helen stood in the garden behind her townhouse, pruning her roses in the chilly morning sun. There was peace in it, in the soil, the repetition. She had spent years keeping her head down, working hard, saying little, never demanding recognition. But she had never stopped watching, and watching had always told her more than speaking ever could. Inside, her phone buzzed. A text from Dana. Board is preparing a closed-door session Monday a.m. Remington will be present. Likely outcome, administrative leave pending audit. I'll keep you updated. Helen replied with a single word. Understood. Sunday evening, the board sent an encrypted message to Scott's inbox requesting his presence for an urgent executive discussion at 8 a.m. Monday. Brooke received nothing. She wasn't on the calendar. That made her more nervous than being summoned would have. Scott didn't sleep. He stayed up pacing the length of his home office, phone in hand, thinking through statements, timelines, denials. He knew the board wouldn't ask him in early unless they'd seen something serious, something they couldn't ignore. Helen, by contrast, made tea. She set out her clothes for the next day, a simple navy blue blouse, gray slacks, comfortable shoes. Nothing flashy, nothing angry, just professional. At 6:30 a.m. on Monday, she left her house before the sun had fully risen. She took the long route to the office, driving past the river, the bridge, the bakery that used to open before dawn when her son was still a boy, and she packed his lunches. By 7:45, she was at her desk. Not a single item had been packed. Across the floor, Brooke walked in, looking pale and overly made up. Greg gave Helen a quick glance and a nod before disappearing into a meeting room. At 8:01, Scott walked past her with his head down, entering the boardroom without a word. Helen didn't look up, but she smiled. Inside the boardroom, the mood was grim. Scott sat at the long, polished table while 6 members of the board listened in silence. No introductions, no pleasantries. Leonard Grant placed a folder in front of him, and Elaine Warner, seated to his right, leaned in. "Scott," she said, "this is not an accusation. This is a formal internal review. We've received credible documentation involving improper vendor payments processed under your authority during your tenure as operations consultant." Scott opened the folder. His face barely changed, but his fingers twitched. Red Pine invoices, approval stamps, calendar invites, emails with subject lines he thought had vanished into the ether. "This is a coordinated mischaracterization," he said smoothly. "Standard contractor procedures, all approved under legal guidance. These payments were processed before my official hiring. I had no fiduciary power at the time." Your email signature used the title Acting Transition Advisor. "That role includes operational oversight," Elaine replied. "You signed off on vendor disbursements exceeding internal audit thresholds without a second approver." Scott paused. "That was an emergency procurement process. The company was restructuring." Leonard interrupted. "The vendor doesn't exist, Scott." Silence. "We've already spoken to Haldertech," Elaine added. "They cited discrepancies in partnership handoffs, and we're now aware of your personal connection to Red Pine's listed email domain." Scott's jaw tightened. "Effective immediately," Leonard said. "You are being placed on paid administrative leave pending a full external audit. Any attempts to interfere with internal systems or communications will result in escalation to legal." Scott said nothing. He closed the folder and stood, his hands slightly shaking. As he left the room, he avoided eye contact with everyone. At 9:10 a.m., Helen was still at her desk. She sipped her coffee slowly as a hush spread across the office. Everyone knew something had happened, even if they didn't know what. Brooke stormed into Scott's office 5 minutes later, only to find it locked. She tried his number, straight to voicemail. Then came the second blow, an email from HR. Please make yourself available at 2 p.m. today for a compliance interview regarding vendor partnerships and employee communications. Brooke froze. Across the floor, Helen printed a copy of a single-page letter. She placed it in a white envelope, sealed it, and tucked it inside her bag. No one noticed. No one ever noticed Helen, until now. By noon, the office felt different, quiet, strained. People glanced at Helen's desk, half expecting it to be empty. But it wasn't. It wouldn't be. Not yet. As the afternoon light faded, the subdued hum of the office seemed almost to carry whispers of impending change at exactly 2 p.m. The scheduled HR compliance interview sent a ripple through the remaining staff. Brooke, visibly discomfited, entered a conference room with trembling hands and a vacant expression that betrayed her usual practiced confidence. No one knew what the interview might reveal, but her silence spoke volumes. In contrast, Helen remained at her desk, calm and methodical. Every inch of her surroundings, each neatly organized file, every carefully positioned personal item, spoke of a woman who had long mastered the art of control. A short while later, Helen's phone rang. It was Dana. The board needs a few more minutes to finalize questions for the next session. Dana's measured tone came through. They're very close to deciding on further action. Helen's eyes drifted from the computer screen to the envelope resting discreetly on the corner of her desk. Inside it lay the final piece of documentation that connected insider conversations, archived Slack threads, and a clear, time-stamped message. A message that could unseat the remaining alibi of those who'd wronged her. In the midst of this quiet chaos, Greg appeared once again by Helen's cubicle. His voice was barely above a whisper. I overheard something. Someone mentioned that the board might bring in external auditors. They want a complete audit by week's end. His words, laced with uncertainty and guilt, underscored the shifting dynamics. The company was no longer a secure fortress for misconduct. Instead, it was beginning to crumble under its own deceit. Helen looked at him steadily. Thank you, Greg, she said softly, her tone carrying both reassurance and resolve. He offered a slight nod before retreating back to his workspace, leaving behind the weight of unspoken alliances. Minutes later, as the clock neared 4:30 p.m., a senior board member, Leonard Grant, discreetly approached Helen's desk. His voice was low and urgent. Miss Foster, may I see you in my office immediately? His expression was a mixture of respect and cautious inquiry. Helen gathered her few personal belongings, including the envelope, and followed him without a hint of hesitation. Outside her cubicle, murmurs spread among the staff. Some exchanged glances of awe, others wore expressions of bewildered relief as if witnessing long-awaited justice. In Leonard's dimly lit office, surrounded by files and muted screens, Helen placed the envelope in front of him. This is the evidence I've gathered over many years, she said plainly, her eyes unwavering. It connects the dots. Every fraudulent transaction, every improperly authorized payment, every conversation that suggested manipulation. Leonard's gaze softened as he realized the full weight of her disclosure. I'll ensure this reaches the board in full confidence, he promised, his tone solemn and decisive. As Helen left the office, the corridors felt charged with an electric anticipation. By the time she returned to her desk, the once quiet hum had risen to an undercurrent of murmurs, speculation, and a newfound sense of justice. It was clear. The final act was imminent. Tuesday morning arrived with an unfamiliar chill in the air, despite the sun outside. The office lights flickered on earlier than usual. Leonard had summoned a full board meeting before business hours. The envelope had circulated through the boardroom, now stripped open and laid bare on the long glass table. Dana was present, calm and clear, guiding the directors through every timestamp, signature, and contradiction. By 9 a.m., the audit was official. External investigators were contracted. It began access lockdowns across several accounts. One of them was Brooke's. She didn't see it coming. At 9:12 a.m., she tried to log in and was met with a red screen. Access denied. Please contact administrator. Her heart pounded. Within minutes, HR called her in, this time not for an interview, but for a formal suspension pending investigation. Her protests were quiet, disbelieving. You don't understand. This is political. This is a misunderstanding. Scott approved everything. But Scott was gone, and now so was she. Across the floor, Helen continued typing, her face serene. She didn't flinch when Brooke stormed past her desk, eyes wet and stunned, her handbag clutched like a lifeline. Brooke didn't look at her. She couldn't. At 10:30 a.m., the internal announcement went out. An external compliance review is underway. Interim leadership will be announced within 48 hours. The company remains committed to transparency and integrity. There was no mention of names, but everyone knew. By noon, Greg appeared again, this time with 2 coffees. He handed one to Helen without a word. She took it, nodded, and gestured to the seat beside her. "You'll need to relearn some of the reporting protocols," she said evenly. "They weren't following procedure. I can walk you through the real ones." He sat, grateful, ashamed, but ready to listen. At 4 p.m., Dana called Helen to confirm. The board had not only initiated the audit, but also recommended her for a consulting position, quietly, respectfully, should she wish to guide the internal transition. No contract was discussed yet. It wasn't about a job. It was a gesture. Helen declined. She walked out at 5:01 p.m., the same time she had for 15 years. No box in hand, no tearful farewell, no victory lap, just peace. She stopped at the lobby doors and turned once, her gaze sweeping across the floor where so much had changed. And then she walked out, lighter, freer, and whole. The damage had been done. And now, so had the repair.